Mark Wahlquist, and I hate to say this, I guess he worked at Eat, Sleep, Play. Now, I co-own Eat, Sleep, Play, and I don't remember this guy, but that doesn't mean he wasn't there and he wasn't crucial and he wasn't super talented. Towards the end of Twisted Metal, with Eat, Sleep, Play, Scott and I were not getting along, and so he may have been somebody who came on later. But this guy, Emerald Eel, reached out to me and he said, what do you know about this War of the Monsters reboot? And if you don't know War of the Monsters was a kind of a Twisted Metal with giant monsters that came out on PS2. It was a concept of mine, but I didn't work on it. I generated the concept, went to 1 or 2 meetings, and I moved on. I don't have much allegiance or affection with it, but that's what it is. Okay, so this guy, Emerald, says, I shot Mark an email about the canceled reboot. He had a lot to say. I just want to read you this. I want to rebuff some of this because it's certainly not my experience, but some of it is. But let's put it this way. If I don't comment on it, then assume I agree with what he said. But if I do comment on it, I will give you my take on it. Here's what he said. Scott Campbell and another dude whose name I can't remember were running incognito before I became involved in the story. I don't know who he's talking about. Maybe Randy Zorko or Kellen Hatch. I don't know. They had a parting of the ways. Oh no, he's talking about Dylan Job. Parting of the ways, and Scott Campbell founded ESP while the other dude went to Texas and founded Whitebox and did Warhawk, right? So that's Dylan. So Scott forms a relationship with Sony. Well, he's always had one. And Sony wants Jaffe to be co-president of the studio. That's not how it went down. Scott and I got together after God of War and said, let's make a studio and let's go see if Sony wants to be in bed with us. So that's what happened. Because in those days, Jaffe was a much beloved by Sony and he was an amazing personality. I saw him work the room at a Twisted Metal event and he was a god to those fans. You goddamn right. So we have ESP with co-presidents Campbell and Jaffe. They have a handshake deal with Sony. It wasn't a handshake deal. It was a real deal to produce 3 games exclusively for the PlayStation, the first being PS3 Twisted Metal Reboot. This is where I come into the story. I got hired about a year into that reboot. Campbell was an absolute megalomaniac. He fired all the designers and insisted he designed the new Twisted Metal alone. Seriously, watch the credits. There is not one designer credited. Well, there is a designer credited. I'm credited, and I think Scott is credited, but I don't know anything about him firing all the designers. Campbell had a huge temper, a huge ego, and was an absolute ass to work for. He and Jaffe got into a real bad place, that's true, and Jaffe was exiled from the studio. He would come in like 2 times a year, maybe. What's not true about that is I was, towards the very end, like the last 5 months, Scott and I were barely talking. And I remember being on a phone call, and Scott didn't know I was on the phone call, and he was just being, he wasn't being as friendly as I would hoped he would be. But that wasn't 99% of the product. I was out there every 4 to 6 weeks. So maybe this guy just didn't see me all that much because I don't remember him. Maybe that's why. The plan was that we delivered a launch title for the PS3 of Twisted Metal with no single player. All this stuff, you know, was to be multiplayer only. They wanted more. We were too small of a team. All that's accurate. He says the fact that we had to add single player and the helicopter were the 2 things that sunk the title. Helicopter, I don't know if I agree with that, but that's his opinion. We were a small studio. The game we had been making was supposed to be multiplayer only. Wasn't even supposed to have a box. All that's true. The last 6 months of development of the Twisted Metal game was an absolute shit show. Campbell was desperately trying to pitch War of the Monsters to Sony. 2 giant monsters got made. My Minotaur and another artist tried to make a giant robot, but he failed and never finished it. Also, I got now that's news to me. I did not know they were ever working on a War of the Monsters. And also, I got tasked with developing stick figures for a Jaffe project that was the first iteration of Drawn to Death that he released 5 years later. Didn't know that either. Sony cut all ties with Campbell a few weeks before Twisted came out, and I was laid off a week before the game came out, which was pretty standard for my career. They did me a huge favor. The studio limped along for years after that, but nothing AAA. Yeah, I left right after Twisted, but I still helped where I could. The 2 artists who didn't get laid off ended up having it hurt their careers. Ultimately, there were a whole slew of reasons why Eat, Sleep, Play had its relationship fall apart with Sony, but that relationship falling apart was why that reboot got canceled. There was never a playable demo of War of the Monsters. The Minotaur was the farthest anything got along, and it was basically using the New York level. And if you're looking at your screen, these are pictures. I did want to help. I did, absolutely. I stayed around for 6 months after doing what I could. I mean, I'm not a programmer. I couldn't fix the bad handshaking between Sony's netcode and our netcode. So yeah, so this was the Minotaur sort of trying to do a War of the Monsters, which I guess would have been a PS3 title. And this is all news. I never saw these until this morning. So people who are into sort of history of Twisted Metal and history of War of the Monsters, there's some brand new news for you that I just found out today. What was the fight between me and Scott about? There wasn't a fight. It wasn't that. It was that Scott has a very big ego and I have a very big ego. That doesn't mean that we're assholes, or I mean, I can't, Scott was never mean to me, but I never worked for Scott. So I can't speak to what it was like, good, bad, or otherwise, about working with Scott Campbell, other than as an equal, or when I was working at Sony, even though he didn't report into me. Ultimately, Sony decided when they got paid, and if I had issues with something, I would go to my boss, and he did have Scott's ear. But anyway, no, we didn't have a specific argument. It was just the fact that I think that Scott thought he knew best. I thought I knew best. He had a very different idea of the kind of games he wanted to make in his life. I had a very different idea about the games I wanted to make. And it just was never a good marriage from the beginning, but it took a long time for us to recognize that our time together as co-creators should have been left to the PS2 era. But yeah, I mean, we never really had any knockdown, drag-out fight, but I think towards the end, we were just really sick of each other. I'll tell you where, to me, the moment I realized this was not a good marriage was when we finally made the call that Twisted Metal 2012 would not have the ability to get out of the vehicle. And Scott, to his credit, Scott is a good family man. I think he's a good person. I have nothing personal negative experiences with him, but he wasn't a gamer. He wasn't a core gamer. And I was just like, dude, this is games now. This has been games since 2001. And he just didn't want to take on the nightmare of adding that part. And it's not that I could have fought him on it, but it was just like, that's when I knew, at the time I was like, I want to fucking win DICE awards. I want adulation from, Edge magazine. And I think Scott was probably more like, I don't give a fuck about that shit. I want to make some fucking money. And I wanted to make money too, but I think that was kind of where I realized we were coming at this a little bit different. But yeah, and I don't know this guy who wrote this, so his opinion is valid for his opinion. I'd be more than happy to talk to him. I feel a little embarrassed I don't remember him, but frankly, towards the end, I wasn't talking to the guys actually, nose down in the trenches. What were the gameplay mechanics going to be like getting out of the car, says Lutron? We barely discussed it, because every time it came up, it's like, dude, that's a whole new thing. And to be perfectly fair, this was, we were doing proprietary engines. I think it's different now, of course. These days, if you were to make Twisted Metal, it's easy to get out of the car. I mean, you just make it in Unreal 5, it's off the shelf, you get a bunch of stuff, but this was a proprietary engine, it was a brand new engine, it was on PS3. I get that they were climbing a mountain. And Scott is a fucking brilliant producer. I mean, he's a guy who delivered military simulations to the fucking United States government on time, every time, before he made video games. It's not like he doesn't know what he's doing. But I was used to development where you pushed for those things that were going to be hard, and he was too, but I think I just was willing to push more.